Hello everybody, I'm Kate Cass, and welcome to another edition of Let's Talk About, and welcome to the latest installment of Sherlock and the Curious Critic. This time we're going on a different yet familiar journey in the special episode, The Abominable Bride. In the heart of London in the year 1895, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson are called to investigate a mysterious bride who has appeared to come back from the dead and is out for vengeance. While they set out to work out this case, an even greater and much deeper mystery plagues the great detective, and he must sort it all out before he goes too deep. Now here's an interesting one. You remember how I was reluctant about the premise of Sherlock Holmes being placed into the modern day? Well, now we have this marvelous cast and crew jumping back into the era of the original stories, and I was a bit hesitant. I don't know, it sounded kind of neat, but I thought putting these characters tailor-made to fit into our time period back into the classic time period might feel a bit awkward. Not to mention that it had been 2 years since season 3, and with both of our leads now signing on with this movie studio some of you might have heard of, I knew the wait for season 4 was going to be even longer, and I wasn't crazy about this experiment taking time and resources away from the main story. It had in fact been so long between seasons that they felt the need to recap the entire series before the special. For reasons.
Summarizing episodes you haven't seen. This will be important later. You'll be on the test.
But like a lot of things when it comes to this show, simply getting a taste of it was enough to spark my delight and pique my enthusiasm, which was provided at Comic-Con in 2015, which was so exciting they never released the clips they showed at Comic-Con. So enthusiastic, in fact, that if you are one of the 35 people who were subscribed to me back in 2016, you might remember that I actually already reviewed this episode not long after it aired. However, I'd like to think that every area of my video making abilities has improved significantly since those times, and I was not going to pass up the chance to talk about this one again, especially for this little retrospective. My goal with this video is for it to get more views than the older one. Let's see how I do. So how did this experimental episode ultimately deliver? Well, for one, the transition from a visual standpoint is flawless. A lot of fans of the classic stories say London is just as much a character as Holmes and Watson are, and that really shows in this setting. The age of cobblestone streets and horse-drawn carriages really came alive here, with this modern cast transitioning into period costumes and styles rather smoothly, though some look a bit silly at first. You get used to it. Speaking of smooth, look at Sherlock's locks. You know, this makes me realize that Cumberbatch looks more like the traditional Sherlock Holmes than I originally thought. Maybe it was the hair that was throwing me off. Baker Street is just as cozy yet rustic as it always is. The grand estates remind me a lot of the Jeremy Brett television version, and the lighting especially gives off the effect of creating atmosphere with less sophisticated methods. Being able to see everything in an episode where a good chunk of it takes place in dark environments is always a plus. Seeing this modern setting get the Victorian coat of paint is way more charming than I expected it to be when this project was first announced. There's just something really delightful about it all, especially to someone like me who was originally a fan of the books. Don't misunderstand, I like and gladly welcome most of the changes Sherlock made to fit into modern times, yet I can't say I don't find mixing modern day pacing and jokes with more sophisticated delivery and vocabulary highly appealing.
Mrs. Hudson didn't seem to be talking. I fear she has branched into literary criticism by means of satire. It is a distressing trend in the modern landlady.
Ah, it's like a fine wine. The production work, though, is kind of remind us that despite the classic setting, we are still in Sherlock, with amazing transitions, creative ways of implementing the floating text, and even planning the entire sitting room of Baker Street in the middle of the scene of a crime. It's a sight to behold. I am shocked that this is Douglas MacKinnon's first and only directing credit for the show. He not only has a solid grasp of the visual language of the show, but did an extraordinary job translating it into this new time period. The atmosphere also helps in keeping the mystery of this one, about a woman who killed herself and then, allegedly, came back to life and killed her husband, creating a vengeful ghost in Amelia Ricoletti, played ghoulishly by Natasha O'Keeffe. This is what I was talking about back in The Hounds of Baskerville. People love mixing Sherlock Holmes with the supernatural, or at least the perceived supernatural. But this case isn't based on the original stories, but from a quickly mentioned case in one of the stories. See, this was the kind of thing I was hoping they'd do when they teased the giant rat of Sumatra. This deeply disturbing but curious case and only gets more mysterious as the story goes on. But the case of this gruesome, vengeful spirit of a bride in the Christmas special is not that strange, since during this time in England it was customary to share ghost stories over the holidays. This was a tradition that gave us A Christmas Carol. But at this point, they'd have to mix things up more anyway, since this is the third episode with a segment during Christmas time. This show just loves Christmas. The Abominable Bride really has the classic ghost story vibe to it that can give you a few chills depending on how late in the night you watch this. It also really grasps the idea and horror of taking something innocent and pure like a bride and making it absolutely terrifying. Usually that's not really my jam, but it really works for me here. But before we get too deep into the larger mystery, let's look at the many exciting references to the classic stories in this classic special in our classic segment. The thing about The Abominable Bride is that it has a lot of references, like way more than usual. And a good portion of them are callbacks the show has already made. But since they've repurposed them to fit back into the Victorian setting, I feel they're worth mentioning again. I'm just not going to point out which stories are from again if it's a reference the show has made before. If you've been following Sherlock and the Curious Critic up to this point, which you should have because you're a good viewer, you'll recognize a good amount of these. The 5 orange pips are a piece of this puzzle, and this time they're actual seeds. The Hound of the Baskervilles gets a name drop, as do Inspector Gregson and Jones, and Irene gets a photobomb. The come if convenient or inconvenient message shows up again, the line about never being able to resist a touch of the dramatic, Sherlock calling John his Boswell, and of course, they finally got this iconic line right.
The game is afoot.
Thank you. Was that so hard? But the biggest in terms of references we've already made is recreating Sherlock and John's first meeting in its original time period. They didn't have to do this. It serves no purpose to the story, but I'm so glad they did. It is such a treat. And somehow, 6 years after Sherlock did it first in A Study in Pink, in the middle of a Sherlock Holmes renaissance, they adapted this first meeting for the first time in its classic context as well. Why does no one else want to do this scene? It's iconic. It has a plaque. Speaking of that first meeting though, John's opening narration for the special is pulled right from the first page of A Study in Scarlet as Watson recounts his discharge from the army. And there's a moment where a message is written on a wall in blood that I think is supposed to be a Study in Scarlet reference as well, but I could be wrong. Getting really meta, the Strand magazine, where the Sherlock Holmes stories were originally published, gets a cameo, and there are several conversations about John's writings of his adventures with Sherlock, but we'll go more into that later. I also like the story printed in that issue is The Blue Carbuncle, which was the Christmas story, and as I've mentioned, one of my favorites. For a couple of smaller ones, John's maid Jane is from A Scandal in Bohemia, where Holmes deduces Watson has a careless maid from the scrapes on his shoes, and I believe the name of one of the clients, Sir Eustace, is taken from the Abbey Grange. But there's not many similarities beyond that, except that they both wind up dead. Spoilers! Fun unrelated fact, Sir Eustace is played by Tim McInerney of Blackadder fame, but also appeared in the Sherlock Holmes series with Jeremy Brett in the Red-Headed League. I think this is only the second time someone who has appeared in other Holmes media has been on Sherlock. That's so cool. Back to the books, as I mentioned, the main mystery of Amelia Ricoletti is not inspired by any particular story, but from a throwaway case mentioned in the Musgrave Ritual. And if this sounds familiar, it's because they already reference a case involving a Ricoletti in the Reichenbach Fall, which is either a coincidence, an oversight from the writers, or confirmation that this family is just cursed to cause criminal activity. Moriarty makes an appearance and gets his proper title as the Napoleon of Crime back from Magnuson. There are quite a few quotes from their book confrontation in his first scene, as it should be.
Everything I have to say has already crossed your mind.
And possibly my answer has crossed yours.
And there's another big reference involving Moriarty, but I think I'll save that for later. Sherlock's drug use is also a major plot point here. We see the needle for his cocaine in its silk-lined case, and they pretty much quote the exchange where we first learn about this habit of his in The Sign of Four almost exactly, including Watson's vocal disapproval. In Mycroft's notebook, we see the name Vernet scribbled in it. This is in reference to Holmes claiming he's related to the French artist Vernet in The Greek Interpreter, which means that between this and that story being Mycroft's introduction, that story contains pretty much everything we know about Holmes' family. Speaking of Mycroft, of course he makes an appearance at the Diogenes Club, and if we're being book accurate, everyone's gotta make some changes in appearance.
To anyone who wishes to study mankind, this is the spot.
Fat! Fat!
Yikes. Okay, so yes, Mycroft was more overweight in the original stories. The show's even made several remarks about Mycroft managing his weight successfully or poorly. I should have seen this coming, but I'm just not a fan of how they portray it. I always thought that Mycroft was built that way because he led a sedentary life, sending others like Sherlock out to do legwork, as he calls it, because he just can't be bothered. Not by scarfing down plum puddings with his bare hands and betting on when he's gonna kick the bucket with these habits. This man is supposed to be smarter than Sherlock, right? I don't know, maybe if they had just revealed his larger appearance, it maybe could have been funny in a moment of shock value, but how they present this and dwell on it through the whole scene kinda turns me off. What I do love in this special is how much it truly embraces and pays homage to its biggest inspiration besides the books, The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. This is one of the best Sherlock Holmes movies out there. Mark Gatiss has said it's his all-time favorite movie, and if you've seen it, you can tell how it's inspired Sherlock since the beginning. Focusing more on the domestic antics, that one time when Sherlock emphasized the importance of justice from that movie, Mark Gatiss being cast into the role of Mycroft is clearly inspired by Christopher Lee in that film, and of course, the gay jokes.
There's all sorts around here. Mrs. Turner next door's got married once.
Maybe if we got married, then they'd really talk.
Private Life always influenced Sherlock to an extent, but if you ask me, it is the most obvious here, especially in commenting relentlessly about the impact of John writing about his adventures with Sherlock. Criticizing it is basically a running joke of the episode while poking fun at the original text, like how Mrs. Hudson barely ever says anything in the stories, or John's role of just standing around asking questions. This is the kind of stuff they spend the first 30 minutes of the Private Life commenting on, and it's hilarious. As someone who is also a huge fan of that movie, I freaking loved it.
You saddled me with this improbable costume, which the public now expects me to wear.
That is not my doing. Blame it on the illustrator.
I'll blame it on the illustrator. He's out of control. I've had to grow this moustache just so people will recognize me.
I could keep going, there's a couple other nods in there, but this episode is just packed with so many great details. Sherlock always felt like it was written by fans of the detective, but The Abominable Bride really is such a love letter to all things Holmes, including Sherlock. There's so many little touches that make everything feel more cohesive and can make you grin in that way you do when you think, wow, they thought of that. Like giving us a traditional client sit-down scene where they recount the entirety of events that led into Baker Street that in the stories took up like a third of the pages, or Sherlock recognizing Mary in disguise by her perfume, or having Sherlock and John's appearances be different between the glimpse at their first meeting and the rest of the special to show the years that have passed, or original details like using sign language at the Diogenes Club to communicate with their total silence policy. Even having the top hole of Sherlock's coat have a red thread sewn into it, just like in the iconic modern coat. It's the kind of stuff they didn't have to do, but the extra attention to areas of the story and design work really makes the whole thing more fun and interesting to watch and dissect. I've personally noticed something new each time I watch it, as you can tell from the fact that I'm like 6 pages into this review and I've just been gushing about the presentation. Like I've said, I could keep going. The first half or so of this episode is just a fun, creepy mystery with the Sherlock funny and witty dialogue and a classic Victorian coat of paint, which is just a joy to watch. But I think it's about time to go beyond the surface level stuff and dig deeper into what is actually going on here. And I don't mean with the bride, I mean with the first major curveball thrown at the audience.
This is important!
Yep, Moriarty is somehow involved in this. I know I mentioned it before, but I did not expect him to be a part of this when I first saw it, so that was a shock. And, okay, I know I said I was gonna stop with the surface level stuff, but I have to say how much I love this confrontation between Sherlock and Moriarty. As good as the scene in the Reichenbach Fall was, this has everything I was missing in it. This is much more like the traditional confrontation, but still with a dose of that creep factor that Andrew Scott enthusiastically provides. It's all rather eerie. I have never looked at dust the same way since. But it's also eerie in that the whole thing starts to feel wrong, feeling much more surreal than the rest of the episode up to this point, which doesn't become clear until... Oh, were in one of those episodes. Well, look who just became relevant to the main storyline. Yes, this whole adventure has been Sherlock creating a scenario in his mind palace to solve a 100-year-old case that was similar to the situation they found themselves in at the end of season 3, trying to figure out how Moriarty could be alive after he blew his brains out. There were definitely hints of what was going on over the course of this case. Moments of Sherlock spacing out from time to time and speaking cryptically, and not in the usual way, but in a somewhat haunted way. Things really start to slip through the cracks once the note from Moriarty is found. This reveal of what the story really is tends to be the make or break moment for most viewers, but for me, I found the build-up rather chilling, and while it was confusing when I first saw this episode, it wasn't really in an annoying way, but in a way that left me on the edge of my seat wondering what was going on until seeing Sherlock on the plane again made everything clear. It certainly explains some things when you realize this is all in Sherlock's head, like how John seems to be a bit more clueless, and that approach to Mycroft certainly makes much more sense. If that isn't the vindictive fantasy of a somewhat insecure little brother, I don't know what is. I still don't really like it, but I get it. Also, where during a long stakeout they have trying to catch Ricoletti, all John wants to know and talk about is if Sherlock has had experiences with women. I know this scene is often pointed out as a trope that misrepresents asexuality, but John's line of questioning and Sherlock's reactions are honestly really funny to me.
You must have impulses.
Dear Lord, I have never been so impatient to be attacked by a murderous ghost.
And just when I thought we were done with the Redbeard subplot, this episode goes and mentions it. Twice. I was confused by this little subplot at first, but here it was starting to annoy me.
Why? What's the significance? I don't know!
On the whole, this twist adds so much more depth to this episode than I expected, especially where Sherlock is concerned. Like, for one, how he's devising this scenario. With drugs. Again, this is a part of Sherlock Holmes as a character that the show has mentioned, but it's always come off as a smear on his past, something he's put behind him and doesn't practice anymore because he found an outlet through his casework. This is the first time where we see it portrayed as a problem he still struggles with, using similar justification for his destructive habits as his book counterpart did. Mycroft immediately figures out what's going on, and you hear the instant disappointment in his voice. There's a lot of layers to Mycroft's reaction to all of this, which really fleshes out his relationship with his brother that we don't get to see in most versions, the books included. Getting a glimpse into their past where Mycroft has tried to fight Sherlock's demons with him before, his lack of tolerance for Sherlock not accepting responsibility for doing this, and, surprisingly, a moment of genuinely offering support to his brother. It all speaks volumes about how Mycroft feels about him, and Mark Gatiss really knocks it out of the park. This might be his best performance in the entire series. A full look at Mycroft's character might be better saved for another episode, but this is the latest in a series of moments in Sherlock that have given Mycroft much more complexity than he has really ever had. Someone who wants to look out for his renegade brother, but has distant and sometimes cold ways of doing it, with moments of warmth cracking through every now and then. Towards the end of the episode, he sincerely asks John to look out for Sherlock, since he's more willing to accept John's help. Speaking of which, another interesting reaction is John's. Of course, his present self thoroughly disapproves, but so does his Victorian counterpart when Sherlock snaps back into his fantasy. Watson was also very vocal on how much he objected to Holmes' habits in the original stories, but in this episode's case, it seems to have that modern John edge to it that I've gone on about in previous episodes. Throughout the Victorian case, John seemed to have developed some of Watson's bumbling nature that he developed in early adaptations. Not to an unbearable level, but enough to stand out compared to his modern counterpart. But while John is reprimanding Sherlock for getting high while on a case, the episode actually commentates on this. That John is willing to do what Sherlock needs him to, even act a bit half-witted, if it helps his friend, as long as he doesn't resort to this self-destructive behavior. It really highlights that Dr. Watson is not as dumb as some people, especially casual fans, seem to think he is. After all, he's a practicing doctor and an accomplished author. And wouldn't you look a little less intelligent if you spent all of your time with one of the most brilliant men in the country? This confrontation not only gives us a great reminder of what John is capable of, but displays the essential role he plays in Sherlock's life. Considering that this is all going on in his head, it shows that even Sherlock is aware that he needs John's adamance to keep him on the straight and narrow.
He's right, you know.
So what if he's right? He's always right. It's boring.
This whole reveal and the circumstances of it just open a floodgate to expanding on the characters and the roles they play in Sherlock's life, and the process to how Sherlock found himself in the situation to try and come up with a solution to how Moriarty can be back. Speaking of which, we've still got a case to solve. The case of Ricoletti doesn't lose its relevance just because it's all revealed to not be real. This was a real crime after all, it's just not playing out in real time with Victorian versions of our characters investigating it. So what did happen? Well, here's where things get a bit complicated. And that's saying something. This whole mystery and the legend of the Abominable Bride was created by a group of women who sought justice on unpunished men and an unjust system. Okay, so we could spend a while here, but I'm going to try to keep this quick and concise. I know a lot of people have issues with this turn of events, but I actually really like this idea for a few reasons. 1. The motive. There were certainly moments of period-appropriate misogyny during the special, of women being treated as lesser despite many of them being updated into far more fleshed-out characters. As far as the women go, most of them have the same personalities as their modern counterparts, with perhaps some noticeable changes.
Holmes.
Hooper.
Yeah, I'm not touching that one. Even laying out the reasoning that led Ricoletti to orchestrate this, a lifetime of abuse and being taken advantage of. This is all presented as sort of a last resort. It's not saying that feminism is composed of cult-like murderers going to any lengths necessary to take down the patriarchy or whatever. In fact, there are several moments that emphasize that the rights these women seek are ones they deserve. Cruel men being held accountable, Mycroft saying that they fight to their way of life that they must lose, and recognizing how strong and capable women are, even in the roles society shoved them into.
Has it never occurred to you your wife is excessively skilled for a nurse?
Of course it hasn't. Because he knows what a nurse is capable of.
The only thing the show condemns is the methods, which, given the method was murder, I'd say that's fair. Despite the lengths these women went to get long overdue retribution, the episode is surprisingly sympathetic towards them, and you'd be surprised how many Sherlock Holmes stories showed sympathy and mercy towards the guilty party. 2. The other side of the coin. If every single woman in this special was a member of this group, then I think I'd see where most people found issue with this. But that's not the case. There are positive representations of strong female characters and examples of how to empower and criticize expectations the right way. Mrs. Hudson's objections to barely being featured in John's stories is, in a way, asking for better female representation in the media, and of course, there's Mary. Not only is Mary an advocate for votes for women, although I think the line that mentions this is awkwardly heavy-handed, but she knows what she's capable of and found a legitimate way of utilizing her potential. Working for Mycroft of all people, which is kinda cool. She even figures out this conspiracy before the boys do and joins in on the investigation in time for the big reveal. Mary's portrayal is particularly interesting since this episode came out right after His Last Vow. Well, 2 years after, but production-wise, this was next. Where we learned about Mary's past and just how much more there is to her than originally perceived, which not only ties into the theme this case presents rather nicely, but even though it's not real, it shows how this famous duet has now become a trio. They didn't need to include Mary in this escapade, but I'm so glad they did. It shows how essential she's become to this iconic team. And 3. The cause. I think a lot of people are going to disagree with me here, but I think the notion that people are capable of fighting for just causes in unjust ways is a perfectly valid one to present. The road to hell is paved with good intentions after all. You can justify anything if it's in the pursuit of a greater good, but in doing so, you can make a good cause look bad in the process. Going too far to spread your message that no one hears it, or painting everyone who believes in it in a bad light, therefore not helping your cause. It might not be on this grand of a scale, but this kind of thing does happen. I think the episode does enough over the course of its run to not have this explanation and motive come off as offensive or belittling, and I personally like the motive that even people who fight for good causes can have unsavory or immoral ways of doing it. To present that this is a fight they deserve to win, but not like this. Be an example. Be like these two. That said, all of this might have come across better without the women donning purple clan robes. I get it, it's from the 5 Orange Pips, but still, maybe not their best design choice. But this whole twist is doing double duty as well, taking advantage of being in Sherlock's mind by pitting the scenario against his own past. Again, Holmes was known for having a low opinion of women, but still was courteous to most of them. Sherlock is kind of the opposite. How much he respects someone really comes down to individual rather than anything related to gender. He even objects to how Sir Eustace talks about his wife earlier in the episode, but there are some he has certainly done wrong, like Molly and Janine, and probably one other, who they might not have been able to get to come back for a cameo. It's not the focus of the episode, but something inside Sherlock definitely sees the solution to this 100-year-old case as a moment to look at how he's wronged women in his life, even a little bit. Of course, you're all free to have your feelings on this resolution. Those are just mine. Whew, glad that's done. Okay, great. This was a really elaborate plot by a group of organized radical feminists. What does any of this have to do with Moriarty? Well, first of all, I appreciate they took the time to give this case a solid resolution at all after we realized what its true importance was, especially when you consider that this whole scenario didn't bring Sherlock any closer to the answers he was looking for. Now, for the case of Amelia Ricoletti, the pieces seem to line up perfectly fine. It's elaborate and kind of overdramatic at points, but Sherlock is the one setting the stage here, even if he didn't write the script. The only hole in the solution is one that's created by Sherlock having to plan himself into this long ago narrative. But the method that Ricoletti used to fake her death couldn't be applicable to Moriarty. It just doesn't fit as something that could have plausibly happened on the roof at Bart's. If Moriarty had been standing by the door to the roof, or fallen off at an angle where none of Sherlock's homeless network could see, or if he hadn't blown his brains out right in front of England's greatest detective, then maybe we'd have a case here. But it's just not possible for the solution in Ricoletti's case to apply to Moriarty. So what gives? He must have survived somehow, right? Well, here's the thing. I don't think so. And I never did. One of the most common criticisms I hear about Sherlock, especially to those who take issue with the second half of its run, is that they killed off a great villain like Moriarty too quickly. But when you think about it, he stuck around for a while, especially considering how little he appeared in the original stories. Moriarty is one of those characters whose legacy has become much more wide-reaching than was originally intended. The only reason Moriarty was created in the first place was to be a threat large enough to warrant heroically killing off Sherlock Holmes. Neither were supposed to make it back from the falls, and while Holmes did survive, Moriarty lives on as his greatest enemy. Sherlock definitely embraces that large, threatening legacy to its full effect, and that might explain the dissatisfaction. People were so entranced by this version that they didn't want to see him go. But if you think about it, he never really did. Did you know The Sign of Three was the only episode up to this point where Moriarty isn't seen or mentioned? Even in death, he still looms over the series, a ghost of impending fear and doubt, which is bluntly personified in The Abominable Bride. Sherlock has always been somewhat haunted by Moriarty, a mad genius who never really escapes his thoughts, an intellectual equal who might be beyond his abilities to stop. Just the idea that he could be back when he died right in front of him sent Sherlock into a spiral, using these damaging methods to seek an answer that he's afraid he can't find. The lines between this fantasy and the show's reality cracking more and more as the episode goes on, until it eventually leads us to the true final problem. I don't think I can accurately describe to you how much this zoom out to reveal the climax of the special would be this show's Sherlock and Moriarty having a confrontation at the proper Reichenbach Falls filled me with such joy. This is the first time I've seen this confrontation look like it's taken place by an actual waterfall. The scene and lighting work is incredible and almost makes you feel the chills being there would create. The confrontation feels brutal and tough, with the music cutting out to really add the intimate effect here. This one shot that looks exactly like the classic illustration of this fight that filled me with such glee. It's fantastic! But like a lot of other moments in Sherlock, they may be great at reimagining classic moments, but it's when they do something a little bit different that really makes it stand out. And would you believe, this scene has that as well. John steps in to help. A moment that is unique, unprecedented, and frankly, Lovely. Despite these two being one of the most iconic duos in fiction, this famous confrontation between the great minds of Holmes and Moriarty has always been between just the two of them, with Sherlock Holmes facing the greatest threat he's ever known by himself. Moriarty even says here that this spot is always where both of their stories were meant to end. No matter the setting, circumstances, or adaptation, even in Sherlock, this has always been a battle Sherlock was meant to fight alone. Except for now. This moment shows that no matter what threats lay before them, no matter how deep a hole Sherlock finds himself in, these aren't battles he has to fight alone. Not anymore. That he now has someone that believes in him, to rely on and pull him back up and stand together with. Major confrontations like the Reichenbach Fall and his last vow led to Sherlock having to make drastic moves that left him alone against powerful enemies, because he felt that was the only way to get the right result. But in the battle against his own inner demons and doubts of whether he can rise from this hole he's put himself into, to be able to face whatever Moriarty left for him out in the present day, this is Sherlock finally accepting that he doesn't have to do it alone anymore, and hasn't had to for quite some time.
Alone is what I have, alone protects me.
Nope. Friends protect people.
This is John doing what he has been doing since the beginning, saving Sherlock from himself. And it is wonderful. As is the moment where John Watson gets to push Moriarty over the edge of the falls.
It was my turn.
Which turn?
I know I said that the pool scene from The Great Game was my favorite scene in Sherlock, but this is a very close second. It's like when the Hulk smashes Loki. It never gets old. With all resolved, Sherlock is ready to close this case and make the jump to take him out of this dream, assured that even with the uncertainty of what's going on, he's certain he can face it because he has friends by his side. But not before one last famous moment that is questionable whether it's a book thing or not.
Elementary, my dear Watson.
There you go. Happy? So we wrap up back in the modern day and clarify that while Moriarty is dead for realsies, something is going on. And what is that? Well, that's for season 4 to reveal, but for now, overall... You know, I should have figured that this would be the first review in this series to hit the 30-minute mark. By the time The Abominable Bride ended when it debuted, opinions were mixed. It did have its fans, much like myself, but it did have its critics. There were some people who just weren't fans of this experiment to begin with, and some were up for it, but just wished it was a fun side adventure that stood on its own without having to tie back to the main storyline, like a British OVA. But as I always say, I can only speak for myself, and when I finish this episode, I absolutely loved it, and I love it more with every viewing. Say what you want about how they executed it, but one of the things that always made me like Sherlock as a series was how you can tell that these stories and characters were crafted by people who truly loved Sherlock Holmes. And all that love is amplified even more in this special. It is packed with moments of love and tribute to both the original stories and the universe they've crafted inspired by it. This is something I could easily do a shot-for-shot analysis on because there were so many fun character moments and clever touches that I didn't find a place to mention all of them here. Even a few things that frustrated me. Because while I will defend this episode any day of the week, it does have some rough moments. There are a couple of exchanges that kind of make me cringe, and I think it takes a second or third viewing to really process the whole thing, since the drug-induced narrative can be kind of disorienting on your first watch. Especially when they manage to keep the true nature of the special so hush-hush during promotion. It's an episode that tackles a lot, from completely changing the setting, to overwhelming fan service, to the subject of righteous causes having darker sides, to speculating over the fate of a beloved character, to diving deeper into these characters than most adaptations ever do, especially Sherlock himself. This whole escapade was also basically clarifying that there was no way Moriarty could still be alive, which I know ticked a lot of people off since it pretty much spits in the face of anyone who was excited for Moriarty to come back just as the show was getting their hopes up. But as someone who was concerned about the reveal at the end of season 3, who didn't think there was a plausible way for Moriarty to return, I found this rather validating. I'm not ashamed to admit that this was a real told you so moment for me.
Told you so, told you so, told you so.
It was pretty appropriate to try something this ambitious for the 10th episode, an impressive milestone for a show that produces 3 episodes every couple of years. And while I was skeptical about the premise going in, I admire that ambition, and for the most part, the execution and concepts they present throughout, with so many moments and ideas that made me smile or left me awestruck. If they had polished the main structure of the episode a bit more and omitted a couple of less savory or awkward moments, this might have been the one to dethrone the great game in my eyes. As it stands, it's a very welcome second place in terms of great adventures for the timeless detective. But next time, we'll be covering a long overdue topic here on Let's Talk About as we take our first steps into Sherlock's most complicated era with the season 4 premiere, The Six Thatchers. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next time.